Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
Persephone and Cassandra, Atlas and Prometheus, oligarchy, plutocracy, satire, irony, hubris, nemesis, pathos, catharsis. Sour grapes and blowing hot and cold, opening Pandora's box and leaving no stone unturned, the myths, tales and concepts of ancient Greece echo and reach into every aspect of modern life. Often misunderstood, frequently romanticized, and sometimes deliberately twisted. To understand their origins and truth is to get a real glimpse into the universal themes that connect us to the past and to each other. This is their story.
Άμα θέλεις μάνα δίρε με, άμα θέλεις μάνα δίρε με, πάλι εγώ θα βγαίνω στην αυλή για να βλέπω τον Αλεξανδρή.
Welcome to Podyssey. I'm Alex Andreou. Each week we take one myth, one concept, person, place, theme from ancient Greece, take it apart, figure out its inner workings, trace its tentacles, juice it for wisdom, update, reconfigure, and put it back together, all shiny and new. I want to take a moment to thank you all for listening, for spreading the word, and for supporting this project. And if you don't do any of those things yet, please start. You can support the making of Season 2 of Podyssey on ko-fi.com/Podyssey for as little as $5. An enormous amount of work goes into every episode, and if you value it, please consider funding it. I am planning lots of between-season goodies to say thank you. If I were to say two men were hurling insults at each other, your natural reaction would be to have a dozen questions. Who are these men? Where was this? When? Are they indoors or outside? What are they wearing? What time of day is it? Why did they dislike each other? What's their history? What is their character? Whose side are we on? Now consider how many of those details you can fill in and how many of your questions simply fall away if instead I say a dolphin and a seagull were hurling insults at each other. Whereas before you had questions, now you have a story. You know what they look like, you have an idea of background, location, weirdly, even character. You know that things like when and why don't really matter because you are firmly in a fiction that does not pretend to be anything else. Our knowledge that this obviously never happened paradoxically frees us to concentrate on what happens next. And this in many ways is the key to Aesop's fables. Their universality rests on two pillars, simplicity and brevity. By populating these stories with ideograms or hieroglyphs, a sort of fabular alphabet where A is for ass, B is for boy, C is for crow, D is for daffodil, E is for enemy, and F for fox, there is a ready-made, mutually agreed shorthand that not only obviates the need for most exposition, but creates a world full of colour and intrigue that invites you in a single sentence. The ancient context, as always, is of paramount importance. Cast your mind back to the Cassandra episode or Narcissus and Deco. Those stories are populated by characters who are weaved into a whole mythic fabric. The things that animate them are external. They belong to a collective whole. Their lives are buffeted by tragic fate and divine whim.
But I love it, and I want a lot more of it. You intrigue me.
So how do we end up a few centuries later with a set of tales whose main thread is that the individual choices we make can alter the course of our lives, and the only way to make the right ones is to develop an internal code of ethics? I spoke to archaeologist Alexandra Angeletaki-Røe.
One school of thought tells us that early Greek society, especially in Homer's epic poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey, was built around community values. People lived according to roles in society and the will of the gods. So, as Bruno Snell puts it in the book The Discovery of the Mind, The Greek Origins of European Thought, Homeric heroes do not make decisions based on inner thoughts. They are moved by divine forces. There's not a clear sense of a personal self or inner world. Heroes like Achilles or Odysseus act as part of a larger mythic order, not as individuals with private minds.
Here, this evolution encounters an obstacle. The very first line of the Iliad is, "Sing, O goddess, of the anger of Achilles." The opening line of the Odyssey goes likewise, "Tell me, O muse, of that crafty man and his journey." This is no coincidence. Right at the top, in both cases, the poet identifies himself as a mere vessel through which the divine can find expression. But a necessary precondition for the poet, the philosopher, the teacher, the moralist to be able to speak not to humanity at large, but to the individual human, is that the storyteller must become an individual, must become human.
As we move now down to the 7th century, in the lyric poetry of Archilochos, who was a poet from Paros, we see that something has changed. He writes in the first person. He talks about his own feelings, emotions, anger, love, disappointment. For the first time, the poet becomes a person with a name, a voice, and a story of his own. And this is allowed in that particular place of the world and in that particular time. This takes us to Aesop's fables. These short stories, often told through animals, they focus on everyday problems and moral lessons. The fables are not about heroes or gods, but they are about ordinary people and their choices. The stories are much easier to understand, much closer to the world of the regular people, and they're full of wisdom about how to live. And this marks a full arrival of individualism. People are encouraged to think, make decisions, and take the responsibility for their action.
What is even more perplexing about all this is that in order to craft a serviceable manual for living, in order to give the individual agency, to empower them to apply judgment, you have to make that manual and its rules universal. This is one of the greatest feats of the Aesopian fable. It feels like a one-to-one lesson, when in fact it is history's biggest TED Talk. Psychotherapist Ruth Smith explained to me how that works.
Presenting of facts in a way that is perhaps addressed as a fable or a myth speaks to what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious. And that's the idea that between all of us, we have a shared unconscious mind and we have personal experiences and beliefs that are shared between all of us. And that these are exhibited through symbols, myths, themes, and patterns that appear across culture and history. You know, they can manifest in our dreams, the myths, the stories that we tell, for example, a hero's journey or a wise old man. When a fable, for example, or a fantastical story is presented to us, it's speaking on an unconscious level to a bigger truth that we already know. Whereas when you have a lie that is told that is seemingly a lot more minor, but verges on gaslighting, it's because we know fundamentally it's not true. The listener already on some level, perhaps even unconsciously, knows whether it's true or not and whether it's a belief that they share.
Fostering individualism by addressing the collective, encouraging reason by bypassing it, by influencing the unconscious, unreasoning part of ourselves. That paradox was the first point of my investigation into benign storytelling that also hinted at darker things like propaganda or populism. Because it seems to me that an essential ingredient of success for any cultish groupthink is also to foster a profound belief that it is not a cult, that it is in fact the exact opposite. Part of the conditioning is that it is self-erasing. The indoctrinated must come to see their skewed thinking as arrived at entirely freely. It is the rest of us who are sleepwalking. It is the true believer from whose eyes the scales have fallen. The question is never, how have I come to see an unremarkable pizza restaurant in suburban DC as the hub of some global Satanist child-abusing cabal? The question is always, how come you can't see it? And actually, education works in exactly the same way. The reason we are vulnerable to this is that personal agency is something we both highly desire and find deeply frightening, especially when trying to wean a ritualistic society off belief and introduce it to critical thinking, as Aesop was trying to do.
Agency can be quite frightening for some people, particularly those that perhaps have come from very strict families or religious backgrounds or very strict cultural norms and beliefs. I've worked with people from many different religious backgrounds and beliefs, and oftentimes believing in a deity can be a comfort and a balm. It's almost I don't have to make my own choices. There's this very strict moral code that I can follow. There's a set of rules, and I don't need to question them or think about them or how I even feel about them, particularly for people who have perhaps grown up in those environments. And actually that can rob somebody of their autonomy because they're not quite sure what it is that they want. To step away from that and to really question, just, is it working for me? Not even to disregard it entirely. To step away from that and step out of that is actually a really frightening process. And I've worked with many people that have done that. And to all of a sudden feel that you want to start doing that, that can take a really long time even to make the decision that you want to start questioning, let alone the questions to ask.
Aesop takes this theme head-on in several fables, or rather one fable with many versions. The most famous version involves a shipwreck. One of the passengers who end up in the deep dark water is a cleric of the goddess Athena. His natural inclination is, of course, to pray for salvation. A fellow castaway offers some advice as he passes that became epigrammatic in antiquity. Sin Athena και χείρα κίνη, which very loosely translates as, why not invoke Athena while you swim? Aesop is telling ancient Greeks, in effect, quite directly, that faith and personal responsibility are compatible. You don't have to give one up for the other. It's an early iteration of God helps those who help themselves. It's an overtly political and pretty subversive concept that composer Giuseppe Verdi enlisted for his own nationalist purposes. His opera, I Vespri Siciliani, uses the 13th century Sicilian revolt against the French as a thinly veiled call to arms for city-states in Verdi's time, beginning to coalesce as one Italy during the Risorgimento. A crowd of Sicilians are getting rowdy in the central square of Palermo, in front of the French governor's mansion. Some French officers command our heroine, Elena, to sing something that will soothe the mob. Elena obliges with a ballad about the crew of a tempest-tossed ship, praying to God to calm the seas. Only God responds Your fate, mortals, is in your own hands. Listen to Maria Callas tremble with passion and fury as she says, "Si, in vostra man." Show courage now, Elena exhorts, and rowdiness soon develops into a full-blown riot. Again, we find the light and dark walk hand in hand. Aesop's fables are an empowerment tool, a manual for the downtrodden, but they are also tangentially frequently attached to undercurrents of violence or nationalism. Creating a narrative that has the power to excite the blood provides the delivery mechanism for any message that might be riding along. The arrival of Aesopic individualism becomes the basis of the Hellenistic construct of the global citizen that conveniently springs up around about the time of the conquests of Alexander the Great. We are not colonizing you, honest. We're just making you a full member of the best empire ever. A notion which carries on and grows in importance during Roman times. Oh, no, we are definitely not colonizing you like those nasty Macedonians did. We're upgrading your membership to Platinum Plus, which gives you exclusive perks, like behind-the-scenes passes for the Colosseum. What? Oh, no, don't worry about the lions. They're for a completely different thing later. The Romans are the first to weaponize Aesop in a way, to bring his fables fully into the service of their political aims. I spoke to cultural historian Debbie Challis.
The Romans were interested in Aesop partly because of oratory as well, because if you think about it, they learned rhetoric in Greece. They often went to Greece to learn rhetoric. That was still going, all the way through the Roman Empire. There were still these massive schools. Cicero goes to Rhodes, but he learned rhetoric from one of these great Greek teachers of the time. So Aesop is brought into that because, one of the things of learning rhetoric is learning how to tell a simple tale, to have a simple message with a moral, which Cicero, of course, is very good at. And you can agree or disagree with the moral, but that's kind of what he learns. And that's kind of what Quintilian's talking about, because he's basically talking about oratory. So I think that's partly why the Romans co-opt him in a certain way. And they like stories about authors, much like we do. And I think that's partly where that tradition's come from.
These fables are the perfect exploitation of our natural tendency to fill in the details with what we already know, be it fact or bias, which also makes the fables feel instantly more true, since we are co-opted as their animators. Of course the narrator is reliable. We are the narrator for most of the detail in them. We put the meat on the bones ourselves. But what of the bone structure of the story? This is the key to why there is such a thing as the Aesop Romance, that entirely fictitious and crowdsourced biography which we explored last time. Before I embark on a morality journey, not just as passenger, but recruited as crew, I need to know the captain of the ship is humble, kind, smart, benevolent, unassuming, and wishing only to facilitate my learning for my own good. So we made him up too.
If you've shopped online, chances are you've bought from a business powered by Shopify. You know that purple Shop Pay button you see at checkout? The one that makes buying so incredibly easy? That's Shopify. And there's a reason so many businesses sell with it, because Shopify makes it incredibly easy to start and run your business. Shopify is the commerce platform behind 10% of all e-commerce in the US. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/promo. Go to shopify.com/promo.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
It is no coincidence that the anonymous Vita biography appears around this time, nor that the focus is very much on Aesop being a slave to the exclusion of all other backstories circulating.
Aesop lived so long ago that some even question his existence. Scholars, though, have studied Aesop's rise in status from various angles, and some focus on what the life of Aesop reveals about slavery and freedom in ancient times, covering both the Hellenistic and the Roman period. Others examine how Aesop's changing way of speaking shapes the story's structure and gives a voice to the slaves. There is a text that survived from Roman times called Vita G, which describes the life of Aesop and has been studied by several scholars. And there's a lot of references to the life of Aesop as a slave. Vita G is dated to the 1st or 2nd century after Christ, and it draws on earlier oral traditions that may go back to the 5th century BC or earlier. So the gift that was given to him by Isis is symbolic. The humble, maltreated slave now has a voice, which he uses to survive and gain his freedom.
This is also the first time any allusion is made to Aesop being mute. 7 centuries after he is meant to have lived, with nary a mention of it before now. Is it okay to invent lies in order to make the truth pop a bit more? It's not altering the image, just turning up the contrast. Well, the consensus of the genre's advocates appears to be that it's absolutely allowed, maybe even essential. But here is another kink. The people who get to answer that question are mostly storytellers themselves. Of course we are relaxed about embellishment. I spoke to film critic Linda Marric.
So in Catch Me If You Can, the Spielberg movie from 2002, Leonardo DiCaprio is actually playing a real-life character, although Spielberg does use quite a fair bit of sort of artistic freedom and liberty to sort of add things that didn't really happen. The story of it is as Aesopian as you could really imagine, because it's about a man whose lies become bigger and bigger as he sort of uses deceit to make himself into someone who is truly extraordinary, going as far as to pretend that he is a doctor, not only a doctor, but also a surgeon, and operate on people and getting away with it for a very long time and escaping the FBI. This is very much played out as a kind of like a comedic romp. It's very sympathetic to the liar. The casting of a very young Leonardo DiCaprio. The story here is 100% sympathetic to the character of Frank. I guess Spielberg does see himself in him because he also is a storyteller. Years later, when he made The Fabelmans, which is the movie, the story about his own family, people said, oh, it's not a straight story about the Spielberg family. There are lots of things in it that didn't really happen. And that doesn't really matter. Actually, this kind of artistic freedom of embellishing the stories is really important. If you want a story to be really hard-hitting, you ought to be able to sort of veer off the reality of things. Don't let truth get in the way of telling a good story.
Don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. That's a mouthful. Well, maybe that applies if the fiction is employed in the service of enhancing the truth. But does it still apply if the story is, in Springfield, they're eating the dogs. The people that came in, they're eating the cats. They're eating the pets. I guess what makes the difference is where we are on the spectrum between something that is openly fiction and something purporting to be fact. Most reasonable people will agree that Doctor Who or Charlotte's Web are at liberty to invent. Most reasonable people will also agree that claiming the grieving parents of Sandy Hook victims were actors is not okay. But what about all the stuff in between? What about pretending we hadn't cracked the Enigma code for several years? What about the panic caused by the Orson Welles' infamous broadcast of War of the Worlds? What about a writer who publishes under a fake name? Now, what about a writer who leaves himself great reviews under a fake name? Aesop's fables are firmly in the realm of fiction, but the Aesop romance, by pretending to be fact, exists in that liminal, grey area. Or is it possible that the creator also exists in that in-between space? That the teller of myth spends so much time in and out of that quantum space where relativity and truth do not quite function, that they pour so much of their humanity and truth into the work, some fiction splashes back at them. Hoffmann, in Offenbach's opera Le Conte d'Hoffmann, travels from story to story in search of real love that might make him whole, that might make him real. In the end, exhausted and drunk, the muse appears to him, and he agrees to surrender to her alone.
Que la tempête des passions s'apaise en toi. L'homme n'est plus, renaît poète.
The man is no more, the muse declares. The poet is reborn.
Oh, Dieu de quelle ivresse, embrases-tu mon âme comme un concert divin, ta voix m'a pénétré.
Artistic inspiration is the artist's only real love. Whatever the reason, we seem to have a need for a backstory when it comes to those who create the things that we connect with. This much is evident from the catastrophic effect that unpalatable revelations about famous creative people have had on our perception of their work.
People are seeking some sort of connection with others and a sense of belonging. And one way that we can do that is through film or music or the creative arts. And therefore, the people that produce those things and give us those, they become their work. They embody a set of ideals or a concept of beauty or creativity that we are drawn to and are seeking. When we find out something about them that we dislike, that is abhorrent to our collective values and morals, then it diminishes the association that we have with their work as something of beauty and something to teach us. It's almost as if the biography of the storyteller validates the story, and therefore whether or not we can believe in it.
I have read so many essays about whether this ought to be so, about whether it's fair to sully the art with the flaws of the artist. Those musings are nothing but the magical thinking of people who wish they could watch Manhattan again, or listen to Thriller again, innocently once more. Should the crimes of the director or composer be visited on the work? Who knows? Who cares? Why waste time with what should happen when we know what does happen? It's not as if one could command oneself to have a different reaction, to unknow what they know. The reverse, of course, is also something that we do. When we like the work, we imagine the creator in certain glorious ways, and we don't suffer gaps in celebrity biographies, not even in death. Elvis and Tupac have been leading quite active afterlives. A vacuum begs to be filled. I can't pop 4 minutes 33 seconds on the turntable without being tempted to hum a bit of Rossini, just to spite Cage. And when we do fill in the gaps, Isn't it funny that we do so in the right genre? Byron's lost moments are poetic and melancholy. Shakespeare is always in love. Mozart is irreverent. Austen is having a picnic somewhere. Edith Piaf is in pain. Cleopatra is sexy and languid. Wilde is terribly busy generating witty quotes, even today. Aristophanes dies when an eagle drops a turtle on his head, and one can almost hear the comedy sound effect. When Greta Garbo disappears for years, it is to spare us her decline. But when Agatha Christie wants to be alone for 11 days, everyone is convinced she was planning some dastardly murder, probably involving digitalis, a racist children's rhyme, and a misprinted train timetable.
It's why these stories are true. It makes them more real. If she's a massive crime writer and then she goes off and nobody knows what's happened to her, big mystery, and then she's found, obviously, it makes the stories seem more true. There's a weird thing that we don't quite want to accept fiction. Think about the Brontes, and the reading of their lives into their books. And of course they wrote about their lives, that's what they knew, but, Mr. Rochester is completely made up. So I think that's part of it. This kind of folksy wisdom that Aesop comes out with has to come from a folk character. It would be completely different if we found out that Tiberius the Emperor, I think, was just writing them down in his spare time. If he'd written these tales, I don't think it would have quite the same meaning. So that's partly, I think, why it has to be from a former enslaved person or a freedman or something from the lower classes, because it has that realness to it.
In that sense, creating an entirely fictitious backstory for a writer whose purpose is to teach morality is a stroke of genius. He's perfectly moral. He's untaintable, unimpeachable. And if you're going to construct him from scratch, well, he may as well be perfect for the job. Is that why this first biography invents the story of his being mute? Is that anonymous author unconsciously mimicking the structure of what he is attempting to do, give a voice to the downtrodden? It is also around this time he is made definitively foreign, and physically as far away from the classical ideal of beauty as humanly possible. Again, no half measures, might as well pile it on. Now, the first element of this, the foreignness, makes relatively easy sense. If you cast your mind back to the King Midas episode, even way before the Hellenistic era, a sort of early Orientalism existed that assigned stereotypes to the South. Remember, Greeks saw division not as East and West, but North and South. It saw Asians as a product of climate, mysterious and clever, but also submissive and underhand. The seed of Scheherazade, who also uses storytelling to evade her fate, is already present in Aesop. And just like Aesop, Ravel's Scheherazade, based on Tristan Klingsor's poems, dreams of freedom, dreams of sailing away, of experiencing that magical continent that she's confined and condemned only to narrate. Could it be that longing is an essential ingredient in storytelling? The second element, the unsightliness, the physical impairment, or in many cases both, is a little more complex. As society moved from agrarian to small city-state to cosmopolitan Hellenicism, storytelling goes from Homer's collective identity to Archilochos' introspective self to Aesop's internalized individuality. Visual representations also evolved.
And that's when we also have a great shift in iconography. That means that up to Alexander the Great and the classical Greece, there's very few portraits of actual people. Most of it is idealized statues or representations of people that would be dedicated to the gods for the pleasure of the gods. But then we start having portraits of people, and we can have people of everyday life with their name under the inscription, standing in a sanctuary, let's say for Apollo or for other gods, representing the family that had money enough to be able to deliver such a gift to the gods. So then that becomes a representation of the individual himself. There is a Challis in the Vatican Museum, dated in 425 before Christ. A Challis is a wine cup that they used to drink, and it shows a bearded man with a large head speaking to a fox. Many believe that this unusual scene represents Aesop, known for his animal fables, especially about clever foxes.
The man depicted on the Challis is astonishingly similar to the shadow puppet figure of Karagiozis, one of the primary art forms for revolutionary subversion when Greeks were under Ottoman occupation. Karagiozis is still popular in Greece, and he was always getting in trouble with his Turkish masters and always using his cleverness to turn things to his advantage and get one over on the Pasha or the Hajj. The figure on the Challis is also holding something that could be a crutch. Had the construction of Aesop as a person with disabilities already begun by this point? Certainly after the fictional Vita is written, visual artists run with it, starting with an incredible statue from the Hellenistic era, the original of which is lost, but many plasters and sketches survive. The bottom half of the body is so small that at first glance it looks like a bust, until your visual cortex takes in the penis, or the fig leaf in more modest renderings. Again, as with his many biographies, each painter or sculptor seems totally comfortable assigning completely different physical characteristics to Aesop, provided they stay as far away from the classical Greek ideal of beauty.
My favourite is actually by Velasquez. 1638 is Velasquez's portrait of Aesop. That's just before there's a translation for the Dauphin. So in the mid-17th century, you're getting this kind of interest in Aesop as a person, but also retelling his tales. The reason I particularly like the Velasquez one is, again, he's not a pretty-looking person, but he's got character, real character. It's older. His clothes are fairly rustic. His face is worldly wise. It looks like Michael Gambon a bit, I think. Maybe that's just me. But despite all of this, despite his rusticness, he's holding a book, holding this book. So it kind of makes him an author. He's not well-dressed. He's not a gentleman. He's clearly lower class, that he's holding a book, which would imply that he can read. And in fact, because he's Aesop, he can write. So it's a realistic depiction of him as a humble working man with wisdom, worldly wisdom, but holding a book, which I think is quite unusual for showing Aesop. Another version which touches on another area is a ceramic statue, which is in the Fitzwilliam. It's made by Chelsea Porcelain Company that's based in London, as you guessed by the name. And it shows Aesop as a black man, very obviously a black man. And you also get images of the fables made as porcelain. The fact they're made by a porcelain company says something about Aesop's popularity at that point in their identifiableness. People would know who that was. People would know if you have a tortoise and a hare around a candlestick, what that is.
The bulk of the Aesop romance is to do with his status as a slave. Now, indentured servitude in much of Greek antiquity is not exactly what we picture by more recent standards. It is a nuanced, often non-permanent status with many gradients to it, most of which are closer to serfdom.
Slaves in ancient Greece, they could be captured by merchants or pirates and looters of the time and lose their freedom even if they were rich or famous. They did many jobs. Some worked in homes, others in fields, others in mines or skilled workers. But life was hardest for those in farms and mines. If you were, for example, a nanny working for a family or a servant, you had an easier life and you would also establish close relations to the family. And sometimes you would get also several privileges. If you were a slave in the farms or field work, life was harder. But the worst of all was the mine workers. And in several times in history, we have revolts of the slaves, like the Labrian one in the classical times. Slaves could also be freed. If there were relatives that were looking for you and they had money, they could buy you and you could get your freedom back. Others saved up money to buy freedom or were freed for doing something brave. Some could also be freed by their owners.
As Romans conquered the known world, the slave class really grew huge and much closer to the horror of bondage we know from more recent imperialism. And to a largely illiterate oppressed majority, oral traditions are key. More than key, they are the only available education and the only available art. Is this why the anonymous author of Vita G focuses so closely on Aesop's status as a slave? Is it to provide a manual of survival to the masses? Or does taking these stories out of oral tradition, which is egalitarian, and into written form, actually appropriate them, depriving the illiterate masses of ownership over the definitive form? Remember, much is made of Aesop's stories about the weak prevailing over the strong, but there is an equal, if not larger, amount of fables that are about knowing your place.
What actually happens in the transition from the Hellenistic world to the Roman world, which could be a part of the myth connected to Aesop, which is actually not historical, but the function of a society delivering an important message, is that we have more slaves. The Romans introduce a vast amount of slaves captured in their expeditions, and these people become voiceless in a society that they have no rights. So the oral tradition represents a tradition that's egalitarian, and the tales that it brings with them, as long as they capture your attention and you can use them to suggest to people how they have to live, people follow them. But now the Romans bring a kind of distinction between this tradition that belongs to the literate and the traditions that belong to the slaves that are not literate.
You open the Walmart app and boom! The Reebok and Hanes styles that keep your kiddos on their A game delivered in as fast as an hour. That's right, those comfy Hanes Performance Crew socks they love in the app. And the coolest shirts, shorts, hoodies, and leggings from Reebok? Yep, Walmart's got them. They'll feel so focused in their new gear they won't even notice you freaking out on the sidelines. Shop Reebok and Hanes in the app. The Walmart you thought you knew is now new. Subject to availability, fees, and restrictions apply.
I have a story I must tell to the sinner man on earth.
Gregory Nagy, in his book The Best of the Achaeans, proposed that Aesop is a central figure for understanding the archaic Greek notion of pharmakos. We will explore this concept more in future, but the TLDR version is that whenever things went badly wrong in early Greek society, a victim would be sought to placate the gods, and the target would always be anyone who deviated from what was seen as standard.
Great drops of sweat like blood ran down in an agony parade.
This may be why Aesop has every conceivable obstacle thrown at him. With his cleverness, he's not simply prevailing over his nature, but like Scheherazade, prevailing over his destiny. He is quite literally evading death. And the bigger the obstacles he has to overcome, the more affection we have for him, the closer to him we will feel.
There's a depiction of Aesop from 1855, which is by a German painter, Johann Michael Windmar, which is actually in the Royal Collection, and it shows Aesop as somebody, which I think we would perhaps now say dwarfism, but somebody of short stature, sat on a rock, surrounded by people listening to his every word, and animals listening to his every word. And behind him is a Doric temple. There's even the statue of Pan, whose face is turned towards him. And there's people from all kinds of classes. There's somebody on a horse, so that's the kind of knight class. There's sort of servants, people just getting water. Older, looks like Socrates in the front. And I think this is this idea that he's giving these fables to everyone. It doesn't matter who they are in society, what their age is, wild and domesticated animals. I also think it's interesting that it's part of the Royal Collection. Winter is a Nazarene painter, which is a little bit like the German version of the Pre-Raphaelites, but less radical. Part of the Bavarian court in Munich. So part of that kind of neoclassical movement at the Glitzertag. He accompanied the Crown Prince around Greece and to the western shores of Turkey. And Queen Victoria bought another painter by him called Ossian, who is another poet who, again, is kind of made up. And she gave it to Prince Albert, and then Prince Albert later bought this painting. This is, I think, something about Victorian values, about that kind of idea that moral stories imparted to everybody, even animals, have this kind of ennobling effect. If you can hold an audience, there's something uplifting about it that even Socrates listens. That's a pinnacle, even if it's a simple tale.
But why does it matter that we feel for the narrator? Because whether a narrator is reliable or unreliable affects the weight we attach to their stories. In fact, there is often a sense that the very best narrators are those who will allow the story to take them over. Again, a prerequisite for this is for them to be salt of the earth rather than cerebral. Learned people do not lend themselves to possession.
Quand'ecco, a liedri spiriti, come in un sogno parve, la vision ferale, di spavento dell'arve.
Azucena, the gypsy woman central to Verdi's Il Trovatore, is taken over by the story of how she avenged her mother's lynching and burning at the stake by killing the evil count's infant son. She's taken over by the story to such an extent, she ends up revealing a secret she has kept for decades. It's like her body is taken over against its will. When her stunned son asks her to confirm the story afterwards, she dismisses him, doesn't even remember saying any such thing. The audience here is asked directly to credit her absolute reliability as a narrator, even when it is contrasted with her later denial. When the story takes over, she is truthful. When her mind is in charge, she has an agenda. This hints at something emphasized again and again by Aesop being depicted as the anti-learned man. Common sense is antithetical to philosophy. Smart people are silly. Straightforwardness, lack of artifice, is key to truth. As the Greek saying has it, από μικρό και από τρελό μαθαίνεις την αλήθεια. If you want to learn the truth, ask a child or a crazy person. Education can manipulate language to tell lies. Status can impose its view. Good looks can charm others into bad decisions. Remember Aesop's I am not handsome enough to get away with lies from part 1. Why is Forrest Gump, for instance, portrayed as someone with learning difficulties?
What's interesting with Robert Zemeckis' adaptation of Winston Groom's Forrest Gump is that it takes an everyday man and turns him into a hero, someone who is able to transcend class and education to become someone who is understood by many, by all, in fact. He is a storyteller. He's someone whose understanding of the world is so pure, whose understanding of the world comes from a really good place. He's good because he's good. That's all he wants to be.
We got a whole bunch of boats, 12 Jennies, big old warehouse. We even have hats that say Bubba Gump on them. It's a household name.
Hold on there, boy. Are you telling me you're the owner of the Bubba Gump Shrimp Corporation?
Yes, sir. We got more money than Davy Crockett.
Boy, I heard some whoppers in my time, but that tops them all.
Well, I thought it was a very lovely story, and you tell it so well.
And this earnestness can be supercharged by creating a fake biography. Forrest Gump is inserted into famous historical footage by the director. I wonder how many people believe that Gump actually existed.
It's about him trying to understand those historical events in a more sort of palpable way. I mean, because watching history on television or in the news is very different from taking a person and injecting them in those historical moments. He's an observer of the development of a nation, and he is there to witness the creation of an America that is all-powerful. And this is a movie that was released in 1994, but the book was released in the mid-'80s, which is not very far from the end of the Vietnam War, a war that made America into the villain, really. Forrest is a witness to America's development into that.
Just like Forrest Gump, Aesop is everyman. And that quality is far from invalidated by his being a blank slate. It is enhanced. It allows the audience to project onto him whatever we need. Charlie Chaplin understood this. He's reported to have said that he feared the barber, the everyman he played in The Great Dictator, his superb 1940 anti-fascism opus, might destroy the legacy of that other beloved everyman of his, the tramp, by giving his close cousin too much specificity. In truth, like Aesop, the moment he gets a voice is magical. Downtrodden, voiceless, clever, piercing Aesop feeds directly into the traditions of ancient Greek comedy, the fool in Elizabethan drama, Zanni in Commedia dell'arte, Figaro in his many stock variants, the clever servant in Comedy of Manners, straight to what Spike Lee described as the magical Negro stock figure, expressing dismay that it persists, from Jim in Huckleberry Finn, along with his counterpart, the Mamie in, say, Gone with the Wind, all the way to Oda Mae Brown in Ghost and John Coffey in The Green Mile. Useful at this point to remind you that somewhere in late Byzantium, Aesop was made, out of nowhere, also black. This tradition also takes us straight into the everyman down-to-earth balloon burster in modern sitcom. And it is instructive that they are the character who is meant to be the audience's access point, our ears and eyes incredulously observing the ridiculous intellectuals make a mess of everything.
You often get stories being told by the working class servants, particularly. I'm thinking again of Jane Eyre and Bessie telling stories of the moor, the dreams, how you read dreams. In Dickens, you get often the kind of real stories from the servant. Marriage of Figaro, to take an example, but that's the same plots as in a lot of Greek comedy, late Greek comedy, the Hellenic comedies, if you like, Menander. It's usually a servant who saves the day or is the cleverest one in the house. And these then become the model. Plautus, they're big amongst Romans, that kind of idea of the household slave who knows everything, knows what everybody's up to. And then you get them translated into Shakespeare. Almost every comedy that's run around, the Frasier comedy with people going out one door and coming through another door, that's in Menander right there. If you think of Frasier, it's the old man, it's the father. He's a sensible one, isn't it? It's the kind of common sense. And he sits there with his dog, him with his kind of worldly wisdom. And that's exactly the same plot as Menander, really. His father, who's from a different era. I mean, just the way he talks, the way he is from a different era. A different class as well. That's partly to have the realness.
Maris is reading Slow Tango in South Seattle. I think it's put thoughts in her head. This morning, I found her cooing over the college student who skims the koi pond.
I wouldn't concern myself.
So you think it's just innocent flirting?
No, I just wouldn't concern myself.
Those characters are always connected to storytelling too, because they come from a different era, different generation, different race, different class, or a combination of those. They cannot relay their wisdom directly. Their reference points do not match those of the people around them, so they speak by parable, which is timeless and universal.
I mean, essentially, they are parables. And if you think about the Gospels in which Jesus gives his parables, they are written in Greek. And arguably, St. Paul, of course, is Greek, Jewish Greek, Roman citizen, possibly a freed man, very much writes in that kind of way, a folksy way. The parables that Jesus tells are very folksy. That's why every vicar loves telling sermons from them. They're very easy to tell. Still, even 2,000 years later, we can understand the meaning behind them. And that's like Aesop.
The line from the homespun wisdom of Aesop to New Testament parables to the ballads of the fool in Shakespeare to Sophia in The Golden Girls is absolutely direct.
Picture it. Sicily, 1912. A beautiful young peasant girl with clear olive skin meets an exciting but penniless Spanish artist. There's an instant attraction. Shortly afterwards, he's arrested for showing her how he can hold his palette without using his hands. But I digress. He paints her portrait, and they make passionate love. She sees the portrait and is insulted. It looks nothing like her, and she storms out of his life forever. That peasant girl was me. And that painter was Pablo Picasso.
Ma, I have a feeling you're lying.
Be positive.
Okay, I'm positive you're lying.
The overt lie is used as an instrument of truth, and the simplicity of language as a means for universality. It's no coincidence that Aesop has been translated into not only most languages, but idioms and even slang, which may not have accommodated longer stories constructed floridly. Nor is it by chance that the fables have been the text of choice for regional languages and dialects fighting to preserve their identity against the imposition of a national language, from Basque, Provençal, Walloon, and Aberdeenshire Doric to Haitian Patois, Creole, and Nahuatl. Aesop's fables are front and center. This is the oral tradition fighting back against formalized education. And the universality of Aesop means that the fables are not just translated, but absorbed. In the 60s, Aesop's fables were taught in Zulu schools after Sibusiso Nyembezi substituted animals better known to his people. Aesopo Monogatari was the single imported literary text to survive the expulsion of Westerners and all things Western from Japan in the 1860s, because Aesop had come to be seen as entirely Japanese. Ruth explains that psychotherapists use this mirroring of language as a tool for making clients feel at ease.
The use of language in therapy is quite interesting. We look at power dynamics a lot in psychotherapy, and we try to balance the scales. And one way to do that is through language. So modelling the client's language in order to meet them where they are can be an incredibly useful tool. So, for example, quite frequently, if I have a new client and they might swear in the session and they can look aghast at me as if I'm going to tell them off or something. So quite often I would just repeat that back to them. And you can just see the relief on them and the smile on their face that they think, okay, this person gets me. I'm not being judged here. Whereas I have worked with other people in the past that perhaps have very high-powered careers, and so their use of language is entirely different, and so I model them where they are. I have worked with interpreters. I've worked with many people for whom English is not their first language, for some who didn't speak any at all. I worked with refugees and asylum seekers. Having an interpreter in the room and not being able to communicate directly with the person was incredibly challenging and a skill that you're not necessarily taught to do. And in that case, you have to rely a lot on body language, and also that body language can differ from culture to culture as well. So expressions of anger or hurt or upset are going to look different. And there was one occasion I can think of where actually the interpreter stepped in and started telling the person off because they criticised the country that the interpreter had come from. And it just goes to show that the power of shared language doesn't necessarily always mean harmony. And actually, there can be some benefit. I had some clients who did not want an interpreter in the room at all. They just wanted to work one-to-one. So our sessions were very simple, very pared down. The language was incredibly simple, and yet we were still able to connect on an emotional, human level.
But that formula, when cracked, can also be subverted. We can be thoroughly manipulated by an unreliable narrator who appears reliable by putting our relative status at ease. Why are so many unreliable narrators, from John Ballantyne in Spellbound to Leonard Shelby in Memento, enfeebled by amnesia? Why is the narrator in Fight Club a beaten and bullied, self-described nobody who is not even named, just like the central terrorized narrator in Rebecca, referred to only as the second Mrs. De Winter? Why does verbal Kint in The Usual Suspects display symptoms of cerebral palsy? And of course, who could have less of an incentive to lie than the corpse floating in the swimming pool at the opening of Sunset Boulevard?
Before those Hollywood columnists get their hands on it, maybe you'd like to hear the facts, the whole truth. If so, you've come to the right party. You see, the body of a young man was found floating in the pool of her mansion, with 2 shots in his back and 1 in his stomach. Nobody important, really. Just a movie writer with a couple of B pictures to his credit. The poor dope. He always wanted a pool. Well, in the end, he got himself a pool. Only the price turned out to be a little high.
This is where we circle back to populism. The populist has this art of constructing an Aesopian narrative absolutely down to a T. Simple and direct as a narrator. One of us, no airs and graces, no high status. Their language is plain. They tell it like it is. They are often persecuted or ridiculous, the victim of a witch hunt, cancelled or debanked.
One of actually the best movies of the last year is The Apprentice, a film that's been treated rather badly by American distributors because of its subject matter. It is a film about the current president of the United States of America, played by Sebastian Stan, who is an absolutely fabulous character actor. Ali Abassi should have had more of a chance to win pretty much every award going. Ali Abassi tells a story of someone who's lived in the shadow of his father, a really patrician force. The family house was laden with fear, and Trump has lived his life trying to impress people, but the only person he's trying to impress really is a father who's been dead several decades. There is nothing authentic about Trump. Everything he is has been learned, and the character of Roy Cohn, played by Jeremy Strong in the movie, is the person who built him to be that way. It feels as though he doesn't know what it is to be a human being. He's masquerading as someone who understands life. He's an alien pretending to be human. There is nothing real about him. He is 100% a constructed character, and he gets all of his ideas from things he sees on TV. He is the television president. He is a character. Trump, in a way, is like a fable eating itself. He consumes fiction and becomes the fiction.
It really is quite extraordinary. The word associated most frequently with the appeal of people like Donald Trump or Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage is authentic, when in fact their public personas have nothing to do with their real background, but are instead meticulously constructed all the way down to the pint of bitter and the messy hair. And that is because truth is not synonymous with fact. Authentic is subtly different from honest. Authentikos in ancient Greek means original, and fiction is much more original than reality. Authenticity and the appearance of truth depend on the narrative, the way the information is put together, not the reliability of the information itself. Now, I am not advocating for more dissembling in public discourse, but I am saying that when we concentrate only on the facts, we can miss the story being told. Consider for a moment the birther conspiracy that Obama was not born in the US. It never really went away, despite increasing efforts to point to evidence proving it conclusively false. Every time a document or testimony would be offered, a further conspiracy would doubt not its truth, but its authenticity. That's because the story being told by that fable was not about birth certificates. It was that a man with that name and that colour skin is not a real American. And getting lost in the facts did not counter it. It confirmed it. It suggested a willingness to justify his credentials, to apologize for him. It asserted something that most people instinctively reject, that our truth is defined by pieces of paper. Think of the Brexit battle bus with "we send 350 million to the EU every week." The counterpoint consisted of essentially accountancy disagreements about the number, but the story being told did not depend on the number. It was that politicians take your money and give it to other foreign politicians instead of spending it on you. Getting lost in the facts fought the amount, but confirmed the fable that some money does go to the EU. A counter-narrative was never offered. All the value the money provided only came into focus after the UK had left. The shape of a narrative is paramount, and in that sense, lies have a systemic advantage, because you can shape them in the service of the story. To paraphrase Catherine Dunn, truth has no concern for anyone's comfort. Lies are tastier. Their nature is to please. We love them. Facts, on the other hand, require the truth to be built around their unyielding shape. It can be done, but it is hard work, which at the moment many leaders do not even try. They seem to think that facts rattled off should be enough for us because they are enough for them. But they are only enough for them because they confirm what they already believe. We know from the study of bias, facts on their own mostly work when one already instinctively agrees with a premise. The art of politics is to convince people who do not already agree. So when you are told that an out-group will eat your beloved pet or assault your child, the facts are not enough, because threat instinct has been activated. We are reduced to frightened children, and the only thing that can bring back calm is an even better bedtime story that wraps one up in safety. That is the genius of Aesop. By discarding facts, he allows the listener to focus on truth. Stories about things that didn't happen, could not possibly have happened, can get to a sort of truth that takes root in deeper places than our frontal cortex. And learning that skill at a time when the liars have not only a systemic advantage, but every amplification tool at their disposal, it is a matter of survival. So join me next week for the final part of this journey when we talk to Aesop's animals, the single most influential framing device, and delve into the actual fables, including ones that you have never heard before. Violent ones, filthy ones, political ones, hilarious ones, tales that have imprinted themselves onto our collective consciousness. A wolf in sheep's clothing, blowing hot and cold, the lion's share, a bird in the hand, look before you leap. Hundreds of bits of moral guidance masquerading as just language. We will try to find out how the truth can be constructed from lies by a man that we constructed from lies. Podyssey is an audio production by Cooler Heads, written and presented by Alex Andreou. A playlist of all the music in the episode, as well as links to the films and works of art mentioned, can be found in the show notes. Creative input, sage advice and expert contributions by the 4 best muses a man could ask for: Alexandra Angeletaki-Røe, Debbie Challis, Linda Marric, and Dr. Ruth Smith. Executive producers, Naomi Smith and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sanghita. Artwork by Simona Canello. Alex Andreou's Podyssey is a collaboration with Sunstone Global.